In the last lesson, we introduced the verbal noun, the infinitive. And the good news there was that there were not many forms to master. The more difficult news is that there are many functions that we find for the infinitive, and we need to look at these carefully. Because the infinitive is a verbal noun, it can function like a noun, and sometimes even like an adjective, or it can function like a verb. First, let's look at some of its noun functions, the infinitive as a noun. So one use for the infinitive is as the subject of a sentence. Even though it's a verbal noun, it can fill that slot that a subject normally fills as the one performing the action. For example, to be here is good. Is the verb. To be here is the subject of the verb is. To be here is good. So we see the infinitive functioning there as the subject, to be here. Likewise, the infinitive can function as the object of a sentence, which is the same sort of thing, but in this situation, the infinitive occupies the object slot rather than the subject slot of the sentence. So, for example, God has granted to the Son to have life. In other words, He has granted is the verb, to have life. That's what's been given. That's the object of the verb. But it's a verbal idea to have life. And so the infinitive is used. Also, the infinitive can function in apposition. That is, to give further information about a concept or a noun that has already been mentioned. So, for example, this is the will of God, your sanctification, to abstain from fornication. So, to abstain is the infinitival idea, and it is further giving information about this sanctification that Paul mentions. And fourth, we have reported speech. This is when the infinitive is used to convey an idea of what was said rather than to quote what was said. So, for example, they began to beg Jesus to leave. If we had direct speech, we would have something like, they began to beg Jesus, Jesus, please leave. But in this instance, we have reported speech, we have indirect discourse, where the speech is not quoted, but the infinitive is used to tell us the content of what was said. They begged Jesus to leave. So these are four key uses for the infinitive as it functions as a noun. But actually our real focus needs to be on the infinitive functioning verbally as an adverb. First, complement. This use of the infinitive is to complement ideas, verbal ideas, that require more information. So verbs like I begin, well, you need to know, what are you beginning? I begin to go, or I begin to eat, or something like that. So verbs like that, like akomai, I begin, require an infinitive to complete the verbal idea. That's the complement use of the infinitive. A very common use of the infinitive is to indicate purpose. There are a number of constructions that need to be learnt so that when we see these constructions involving the infinitive, we will know that purpose is indicated. Now, this can occur with the infinitive alone, but more often will be found in the following constructions. To plus the infinitive, eis to or is to plus the infinitive, or pros to plus the infinitive. There are four different ways in which the infinitive can convey purpose. The infinitive alone, to plus infinitive, eis to plus infinitive, pros to plus infinitive. As I mentioned, those constructions ought to be memorized so that you can quickly identify what they mean. The third adverbial use of the infinitive is to indicate result, and for this we have the construction hoster plus infinitive. Such and such action was performed with the result that. The infinitive will be used in that way. The reverse of this is cause, and we find that with dia to plus infinitive. Dia to plus infinitive indicates the cause of an action. He said this because he wanted to, whatever it might be. Continuing on. The infinitive can be used to indicate 3 different temporal frames. That is, it indicates time before, time during, and time after. And each of these has their own infinitival construction. First, we have time before. We may have prot to plus infinitive or prin plus infinitive. Either of these constructions will be translated as before. For time during, we have en to plus infinitive. So this indicates contemporaneous time, during. Then we have time after, meta to plus infinitive is the construction. Meta, we already know, means after. So meta to plus infinitive we will translate as after. So these translations reflect how we will render these infinitives when we're reading the text. But in actual fact, they correspond to different temporal realities than it may seem on the surface. To translate an infinitive before actually regards the infinitival action as occurring after the main verb. In other words, before infinitive, this happened. In other words, after the main action, the infinitive has occurred. Same with the time after. We translate it after, but actually it indicates an action that occurs before the event of the main verb. This can be a little bit confusing, but it's just worth pointing out when these actions are actually happening. But we will stick with these gloss translations to make things simple. With prot to and prin, the infinitive will be translated before whatever verbal action is conveyed by the infinitive. En to will be translated during or while, and meta to will be translated after. This rounds out the adverbial uses of the infinitive. You can see that there are many uses, both noun uses and adverbial uses, that need to be understood and mastered. It's a small word, the infinitive, without many variations, easy to learn the forms, more difficult to learn their usage.